Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Wednesday, the March the 17th, 2021. St. Patrick's Day, and a happy St. Patrick's Day to all. Enron asks, do you like Irish soda bread? Indeed, I do. Halper asks, was U2 the band a psyop? You know that U2 was originally a Protestant religious cult? Yeah, it's true. The band and its management has made strenuous efforts to remove all evidence of this, but it's out there if you look hard enough. Hello to our valiant moderator, Chad Chadson. Thank you for your service. The founder of the Grace clan was a man called Odo, Comte de Champagne, a Norman, family originally from Norway. He invaded England in 1066 with his brother-in-law, William the Conqueror, or William the Bastard, according to taste. He was styled latterly the Earl of Albemarle. His grandsons, Stephen and William, invaded Ireland with Henry II's mob. They were called Crassus, Latin for fat, the Old French for which was gros or gras, hence Grace. The founder of the Grace clan in Canada was John Grace, who came in 1840. That was before the famine. His wife, Helena Ringrose, survived a typically horrendous journey, 300 lived of 900, to Montreal in 1841. My family founded the Outaouais town of Gracefield in Quebec. You know, the Irish love poor-mouthing, as it's called. But the fact is that until the invention of the steamship, every ship voyage was taking your life in your hands. Indeed, until the steamship, those who had crossed the English Channel, which is no more than 25 miles, but often ferociously fierce waters, could boast of this to their grandchildren. I'm going to read here from a post. It's called The Graces of Gracefield, from GatineauLakes.com. Gracefield, Quebec is named after Patrick Grace, who was the mayor from 1885 to 1890. He opened the first store and donated the land for the train station, which eventually aided the extension of the railway line to Maniwaki. Gracefield was officially created in 1904. Alonzo Wright, MP, a lifelong friend of Patrick, called the town Gracefield at the crest of its citizens as tribute to its founder and leading citizen. Patrick died at age 59, apparently after being struck by a wagon wheel that had come loose. Several of he and his wife, Jane O'Brien, are buried in La Visitation Cemetery in Gracefield. Several of their children also married local politicians. Yes, the Graces, like many Irish in the New World, went into politics because they cannily figured out that government is something that they will never stop making less of. Patrick Grace's store in Gracefield was purchased by his younger cousin, Thomas Grace, and became known as Grace Brothers. Tom and his brothers would become known as pioneer businessmen who were influential in the development of the Upper Gatineau. The Grace brothers were born in Clarendon Township in a log cabin. They were the children of John Grace the Younger and Helena Ringrose. John Grace died at 48 years and is buried at St. James the Greater Cemetery in picturesque Portage du Fort. Honora lived to be 87 and is interred at Bouchette. According to Tom Grace's grandson, Tom Van Dusen, word got out that they were opening up the Gatineau. So gradually, most of the Grace family relocated from Clarendon to the Upper Gatineau. One brother, Martin Grace, remained in the Ottawa Valley as postmaster in Vinton, where he operated a general store. The eldest brother, John Grace, moved to Bouchette in 1874 at 24 years old. He became the first postmaster and owned the general store for 43 years. When he sold the business to L.H. Merlot in 1917, he built one of the first homes, which was eventually turned over for $1 to Bouchette in order to build a new school. He was also editor of United Canada. The youngest of the Grace brothers, Patrick William, arrived in Bouchette in 1885. He also operated a store starting in 1890. However, he died in 1897 at age 34 from typhoid fever. He left behind a young widow with 2 children, as well as his 2 sisters, Maggie and Nora, and mother, Honora. Patrick Grace's grandson, John Grace, the former editor of the Ottawa Journal and Privacy Commissioner of Canada, was quite involved as president of the Gatineau Fish and Game Club. The story goes in my family, it's very strange. Well, it says here, after his death in 1923, Tom Grace's son, Gerald Grace, that was my grandfather who died before I was born, and his son-in-law, Frank Van Dusen, who married Irene Grace, ran Grace's Limited in Gracefield, established the Chateau de Grace Hotel, where the Metro store sits on Highway 5, summered at the large cottage and other properties at Blue Sea Lake, and operated Northfield Lodge Club on 500 acres of land below the mountains at Little Whitefish Lake. A strange thing about my family that my father grew up largely in Quebec, in the Gatineau, or the Outaouais, as they like to call it now. But he never talked about this when I was growing up. It was only after his death last year that I learned that he spoke French fluently. This story goes, I don't know whether this is a rumor or not, but it seems to be believed that his father, Gerald Grace, gambled away the family fortune and thus was forced to sell the resort to Quebecois, which I suppose resulted in my father's lifelong hatred of the French, both the French and the French Canadians. In other Irish news, this is from Charlie Spearing at Breitbart. President Joe Biden joked Wednesday at the White House he wished his Irish ancestors had stayed in Ireland. How dopey is this guy? The New World was a paradise for the Irish, and the Irish have done far better here than they have ever done in Ireland. The president commented as he recalled his visits to his ancestral homeland at a St. Patrick's Day in a video conference with Irish Prime Minister Michael Martin. I joked at the time after I left, I wondered why the hell we left in the first place. It's beautiful, he said. With a bunch of clovers in his pocket, Biden acknowledged the celebrations this year were virtual. Yes, how very Irish. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, and accepted a bowl of clovers from the prime minister. Yes, presumably virtually. Biden also noted he followed the tradition of dyeing the White House fountain green for St. Patrick's Day. I understand that in New York City they have green bagels to go with the green beer. How disgusting. Biden recalled that his grandfather, Ambrose Finnegan, would always celebrate the family's Irish heritage. He'd say, Joey, remember, the best drop of blood in you is Irish. One of the few quotes I've ever been given credit for in my career, I suppose that's because he stole all the others. I said, we Irish are the only people who are nostalgic for the future. Again, how gone in the head is Joe Biden? First, he jokes that he wished his Irish ancestors had stayed in the Ireland, that is to say, looking back. And then he says, the Irish are the only people who are nostalgic for the future. I want to talk about names for a little bit. Someone called Quentin Curtius at Twitter, and I won't use the profanity. All these weak presidents want to use their informal names like we're drinking buddies. Carter started this with Jimmy. Then we had Bill instead of William in the 90s. Now we have Joe instead of Joseph. Use your full name. I quite agree that, oh, yeah, you're my pal because you've shortened your name. You notice that Donald Trump didn't do that. Don Trump. Sounds very plebeian, doesn't it? As opposed to Donald Trump, which is a quite pleasing anapest. I'm not fond. Well, you know, my own name, Kevin, is, it was rare at the time that I was born. It's become quite common. And to my amazement, I learned some decades ago that because of a footballer called Kevin Keegan, for some years, Kevin was the most popular baby's name in France, of all places. But apparently the French go all in on names. And for several years, all babies will be named the same boys or girls name. When I started working at the University of BC when I was 18, I read the introductory brochure, and I was instructed that it would be possible to choose any name that I wanted to. I'd always been rather shy of Kevin because it's quite a plebeian name, and I thought, how about Michael? Michael's a great name. Everyone loves Mike, right? But then I thought, changing your name, nah, I don't hold with that. There was a novelist, an essayist called D. Keith Mano, who wrote several fine novels. I suppose they're hard to find now. And he used to write for National Review, as well as for Playboy and We magazine. He loved to serve on juries for some. Well, I understand why. You get a lot of interesting stories when you serve on juries. And if he was trying to appeal to the prosecutor, he would tell them that he wrote for National Review. If he was trying to appeal to the defense, he would tell them that he wrote for Playboy and We. Anyway, his first name was reduced to an initial D, and he once wrote that, I won't say what my first name is. It's not quite as bad as Dolores, but pretty bad. I've always been suspicious of people who change their names. Joe Clark, no, not Joseph Clark, but Joe Clark, who was Prime Minister of Canada for something like, 9-10 months. He lost the prime ministership because he didn't know how to count. His given name is not Joseph, it is Charles, which is a fine name. Why he changed it is a mystery. Brian Mulrooney was not born, his first name, given name was not Brian, it was Martin. Again, a fine name, but he decided to go with Brian, perhaps to make him seem more Irish, although Martin is a very popular Irish name, both as a Christian name and as a surname. Boris Johnson, the dignity-less Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, was not born, well, that's not his Christian name. His Christian name is Alexander, which is an outstanding name. And I've read, Peter Hitchens is always on about this, that all of his friends and family call him Al, but he decided to go by Boris, presumably because that makes him seem more exotic. Let's go to the chat. Aaron Gobra says Chocokin 666. Can you flesh out a bit? Are all huge rock bands psyops something to do with Ireland? Well, my favorite Irish band, the greatest Irish band, is the Undertones from Londonderry, or Derry, as they call it now. No pretentiousness about that band, to be sure. Visionary Companion says, I seem to remember a green beer episode of The Simpsons. Rustin Shackelford says, the Z-Man had a really good article today on St. Patrick's Day and the Irish. Stephen J. James says, did you hear about the coronavirus infection rate in Ireland? It's Dublin. Okay. Again, from Chogokin 666, green eggs and ham canceled. Enron says, I accidentally went into a supermarket today without my mask, left it in the car. No one said a word to me about it for the 15 to 20 minutes I was in there. I've been informed that just like New Year's Eve in Victoria, despite the fact that, a dozen people have died of coronavirus on Vancouver Island, which has a population of about 800,000, a dozen people in a year, that the bars are all closed tonight at 8:30 p.m. Too much conviviality otherwise. Okay, Matthew Gubbins says, according to an image on Twitter, Joey Biden has an IQ over 150. No. If you look at where he fared at university and law school, an IQ of over 150 doesn't fit with that. Perhaps he liked to party, as many people do, at university and law school, but someone with an IQ of 150 with a minimal effort would have placed much higher than Joe Biden did. GC Style says, what year was the IQ test taken? Well, yeah, there's that too. Halper says the question was half serious. The rise to fame seems contrived. They espoused nebulous liberalism and ended up as globalist shills. I was friendly with a priest in Vancouver years ago. Mendenhall, Edward Mendenhall was his name, and I used to see him in pro-life marches, and he was a huge fan of U2. They had a really big Christian following, and probably to this day there are embarrassing paeans to them written by evangelicals. And then U2 started handing out U2 branded condoms at their concerts, all in aid of AIDS, you understand. And I asked my priest friend about this, and he was suitably embarrassed. David Keith Mano, okay, from New York Times Obituary, says Jim Smith. Thank you for that. I don't know why anyone would be ashamed of the great name David. Very strange. Enoch Powell's Christian name is John. Yes, there's that too. I have a great admiration for J. Enoch Powell, as he styled himself. But why abbreviate the name? It's a mystery to me. Enron says, I think David Mamet wrote for some men's adults magazines or others to make ends meet. Visionary Companion says, does Biden contradict himself? Very well, then, he contradicts himself. He is large. He contains multitudes. Yes, just like Walt Whitman. Again, from Stephen J. James, Muhammad has been the most popular boy's name for newborns in the UK for years. Teddy Saginaw says, the Pogues are a great man. Here's a funny story about the Pogues. When they played in Vancouver at the Commodore Ballroom, some local musician was paid, I don't know, $50 or $100 to be his minder. And he was instructed about Shane MacGowan, that he is going to get drunk. You don't need to worry about that because he gets drunk before every concert and there's nothing we can do about it. But we don't want him escaping before the concert. And so, oh yes, this fellow was getting $50 or $100, and yes, no, I won't let him escape. And as soon as he turned his back, Shane MacGowan had escaped. So he called every bar in Vancouver. There were a lot fewer then than there are now. And eventually he located him at a place called the Fraser Arms, which is on the Fraser River, which is as far south in Vancouver as you can get. And so he had to take a taxi to the other end of Vancouver and a taxi all the way back. But he managed to stumble on stage in time. The Pogues finally got fed up with Shane MacGowan, and they dumped him. So he started a new band called Shane MacGowan and the Popes, which was a Pogues tribute band. Imagine that. That is too funny. Glib Medley says the Cranberries aren't bad. Can't stand them. Absolutely can't stand them. I wish I could recall the name of the musician who said in an interview, in the 90s, that you can fool some of the people all the time and all of the people some of the time, or you can be the Cranberries. Their singer killed herself, didn't she? Yeah, Glib Medley says an accident, got drunk and drowned. I thought that, it's an Irish tradition to try to clean up deaths as much as possible, as we see in the movie The Guard, which I talked about last week. And I suspect that Dolores killed herself, and this was thought too shameful. So they decided to cook up a story of an accidental death. Stiff Little Fingers, a Northern Irish band. They were stellar, pretty good. One of the fellows from the Undertones, he was called John, and then John J. O'Neill, and then he started calling himself Sean. He became involved in a very political band Then he later went back to the Undertones. Their singer, who became rather powerful bureaucrat in Ireland, decided he didn't want to go back to the band, so they found a new singer. Mark Raymond said McGowan canceled 2 consecutive shows in Vancouver. I remember buying tickets for it. Fraser Arms, I drive by there often. Does anyone remember when rock videos first started with MTV in the 1980s, and they were such a sensation? I remember because I was visiting my sister in the Fraser Valley, and they had a satellite dish in an apartment complex, and there was MTV, and I sat there for about 12 consecutive hours, hypnotized by it. I had to be dragged off the couch in order to be driven home. But at the Fraser Arms for, several months or a year, they had this experiment where they had a music video bar. They had a huge screen, and they would play videos, and people would drink and watch the videos. Oddly, this did not actually take off. Teddy Saginaw said his teeth. Oof. Well, I'm not one to complain of other people's teeth. Visionary Companion says about U2, they contributed a tune to a teen exploitation movie in which the girl is planning to get an abortion and may not be able to acquire the funds. I Will Follow plays during this scene. Yeah, during the 1980s, there was Fast Times at American High, Ridgemont High, and there was The Last American Virgin, which I learned is based on an Israeli film. It was a series of Israeli films, which were the biggest thing ever in Israel. And you see the teenage girl having an abortion had come to be, by the 1980s, seen as a rite of passage. I saw U2 play twice, once at the Queen Elizabeth Theatre in Vancouver, where Bono, he was a cheeky chappy back then, not the dour fellow with the rose-colored glasses. And he started climbing up the boxes at the side of the theater, and he ended up, about 40 or 50 feet in the air and stopped, obviously terrified, because there was a serious possibility that he was going to fall to his death. And I saw them later at Commonwealth Stadium in Edmonton on the Pop Tour. It was okay. I preferred the band that opened for them, the Fun-Loving Criminals. Yeah, I suppose U2 is very clever, getting in there with that Brian Eno and Daniel Lanois, and we're so serious. But when I hear a band saying that, we're going to be delaying our album in order to take in the financial crisis or coronavirus or Trump's election, but the whole world is waiting for your record, are they? That's just abominably pretentious. Glib Medley says Video Killed the Radio Star was the first MTV clip. Hauper says, I was hopeful U2 might have originally been signed to IRS Records, which had CIA ties, but no, they were on Island. Yeah, Island was a good record to be labeled to be on if you wanted to be considered serious. Island, I suppose, was like the Warner Brothers of Great Britain, that Island Records stood for quality. I'm thinking, I just remembered Alec Baldwin making fun of Bono on Saturday Night Live. What was that live album they made, Rattle and Pop or something like that? Am I bugging ya? Even back then, Bono understood that he was as irritating as all get out. On Spitting Image, the British satire show, they mocked Bono with this song, And Nobody Knows What I'm On About. That is to say, I still haven't found what I am looking for. Mark Raymond says, who is the most insufferable, Bono, Sting, or Morrissey? I'd have to go with Bono. I think that Morrissey understands that he's an outsider, and I don't think Sting has ever had particularly, grand visions, but Bono No, he's out there to save the world. There was a picture of him when Tony Blair was prime minister, and there was him, Tony Blair, and someone else. And Bono had become so stout that people started calling him Mrs. Doubtfire. Yeah, Miles Copeland apparently had a grand vision for the police that they would become kind of a musical arm of the CIA, but that never happened. Head McNeck says, good evening, Kevin and fam. I'll be listening later as I'm celebrating an obscure religious holiday at my local watering hole. But cheers to you, and I appreciate every one of you. God bless. Well, thank you. Thank you. Visionary Companion says, Sting is pompous enough to think he can have a go at playing the theremin, and that no one will notice he is crappy at it. You know, he made he made a record of John Dowling songs, a medieval English composer. It's pretty good. Pretty good, but that got him on Deutsche Grammophon. Well, Elvis Costello was on Deutsche Grammophon, and so many people, so many pop stars have been on Deutsche Grammophon that that label has become degraded. I'll let Bono and Sting fight to the death, says, geez, he's tall. Glib Medley says, Johnny Lydon, Nee Rotten, is an Irishman. Indeed, he is. I was talking about Julie Burchill yesterday. And when Nevermind the Bollocks came out, she panned the record ferociously in the New Musical Express, particularly the song Bodies, which is about a woman who has an abortion. And she wrote that that Johnny Rotten was just the kind of Catholic Irishman who would carry on like this. Visionary Companion says Andy Summers was the best thing about the Police. No, a fine guitarist. I can't agree. His songs with the Police are just pretty much unlistenable. Sting, well, whatever else you say about him, is a great singer and a great songwriter. Was it Kevin who pointed out that the Beatles were 3/4 Irish, says Hauper. Well, I'm not the first to point it out. Jim Smith says, KMG, any opinion about the band Sparks? I love them to death and have since their first British record. Well, on Island Records came out later. I bought their first 2 American records on Bearsville, which had been released as a double album. There's a lot of great stuff on there, particularly their second album, Girl from Germany, a very, very amusing song. In the early days, pretty much all of the songs were attributed to Ron Mayle, but now all of their songs and their last 2 albums have got in the British top 10, which is pretty impressive considering how long they have been around. But all their songs are now attributed to both Russell and Ron Mayle. And I think what happened is that Russ said to his brother, look, I can't survive given our record sales and given the fact that you're getting all the publishing royalties. So we are going to have to divvy this up. Wait, didn't Sting have big environmental pretensions at one point, says Anrun. Yeah, I guess he did. He's mocked regularly on that hilarious but scabrous Channel 4 show, Star Stories, speaking with some fellow from the Amazon rainforest, with a plate through his lips. And oh no, Sting is going to play the spoons again. I lost all respect for U2 after they bundled their new album on iPhone, said Mark Raymond. Yeah, this was the biggest spam attack in the world, I believe it was called. And Apple had to come up with some programming that allowed you to remove their album, which had been placed involuntarily on your iPhone. Glib Medley says Julie Burchill had 3 abortions. That's always very sad to hear. Anran said, oh yeah, Julie Burchill and Tony Parsons, who later became the beloved Lad novelist, they named their child Robert Francis Parsons or Robert Kennedy Parsons after the assassinated American politician. Talk about try hard. And one says Stuart Copeland was a great drummer. Indeed, and he plays bass and guitar as well, pretty creditably, as you can see in Stan Ridgway, a video from the movie Rumble Fish. Great song. I love Stan Ridgway. In a just world, Stan Ridgway would be in the top 10. Jogakin 666 says Sting was in a Sex Pistols movie. Indeed, he was. Who Killed Bambi, which was written by Roger Ebert. And I'm going to be talking about Roger Ebert tomorrow because he wrote Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. I read Burchell's book on punk. The boy looked at Johnny long ago, says Halper. Burchell is a curious woman. She once wrote that all my heroes fail me, from Stalin to Brian Ferry. I don't think that Brian Ferry would be very pleased in being bracketed with Joseph Stalin. When Bono lectured concert goers on how to vote, I pretty much stopped listening. Geez, he's Tal. Well, there's a story about Bono, which it could be apocryphal. I'd like to believe that it's true, that he started clapping his hands like this and said, every time I clap my hands, a child in Africa dies of starvation. And some wag in the audience shouted out, then stop fucking clapping then. I think that's my second favorite riposte from the audience story. My favorite comes from a photographer, a professional photographer. I wish I could remember his name. But he was down there in the pit, and he had been assigned to cover a Yoko Ono tour of Europe. And every night at the end of the show, Yoko Ono would move from stage left to stage right, and she would shout out at the audience, I love you, I love you. And the photographer got so sick of this that he shouted back, I don't believe you. Jogakin 666 says the great rock and roll swindle. It's a good movie, but it just seems too much of a Malcolm McLaren hit piece. I mean, there wouldn't have been a Sex Pistols without Malcolm McLaren, for all his faults. Jeffrey Pye says, I've got the Island Story 2 CD compilation, clearly a label that tried everything once. Yeah, there was a fad in the music industry in the 60s and 70s for record labels to put out samplers. Warner Brothers did it. Island did it. If you look at those samplers, people loved the samplers because they were sold at a discount price, like 99p at the time in Britain. And they were popular because you got a lot of great music for your pound. Glib Medley says, one of Burchell's sons abandoned her, the other committed suicide. Jonathan Pohl says, The Big Heat and Mosquitoes are great albums, maybe even better than Call of the West. Yeah. There's a compilation album by Stan Ridgway called Songs That Made This Country Great, which has my highest recommendation. It's a collection of stuff from Wall of Voodoo and from Stan Ridgway's solo albums. Unbeatable. Visionary Companion says Brian Ferry's version of Where or When redeems him, but Julie is a harsh harridan and will never forgive him for not living in a yurt. Halper says Burchell's great hero in the book was either Patti Smith or polystyrene, maybe both. I forget which. Probably not Patti Smith, because she actually enjoyed mainstream success. Patti Smith, this is forgotten now, but she was a hustler. Always a hustler. And I don't know, when you're sleeping with the keyboardist in Blue Oyster Cult and the guitarist for television, it seems to me that you're looking for the main chance. Kevin, isn't there a documentary coming out on Sparks, says Enron? This is what I have heard. Here's a story about Sparks, that when This Town Ain't Big Enough for the Both of Us played on Top of the Pops, John Lennon was watching, and Ron Mael at the time had the toothbrush mustache, which he associated with Charlie Chaplin, but most people associated with someone else. Later, Ron Mael adopted, the hairline mustache. But anyway, John Lennon is watching This Town Ain't Big Enough for the Both of Us on Top of the Pops, and he says, "Fuck me, Hitler's on telly." Vera Gemini was a great BOC Patti Smith track. Glib Medley. Yes, I believe that it is Patti Smith's finest hour. The song was written by and sung by Albert Bouchard, who was really the heart of that band. He abandoned his wife and took up with another woman and started bringing her along on tour, to the horror of the other BOC wives. And he was late for a show, or late for a couple of shows, and they kicked him out of the band. But as far as I can see, it was largely because the wives weren't having it. Very funny. One doesn't really expect that sort of thing in rock music, actually. So, oh yes, I've talked about names, and now I'm going to talk about COVID. And this is St. Patrick's Day, and I believe it was 1 year ago today that I made a prediction about COVID-19. That our leaders were going to smother society and wreck the economy. And when it was all over, they were going to pat themselves on the back and say what a great job they did. I'm usually not good with short-term predictions, but I was bang on with that one. This is from Sean Wooler at the Daily Mail. The horrifying impact of coronavirus on non-COVID care is laid bare in a major report for the first time today. Experts warn the pandemic has undone years of progress in the NHS and threatens a decade of health disruption. A surge in deaths and disabilities resulting from untreated cancer, heart disease, and mental illness is now anticipated. The Institute for Public Policy Research, IPPR, says the pandemic has put a severe strain on the NHS and had a devastating impact on patients. Recovering from the setback and developing world-leading care for future generations is likely to cost an extra £12 billion a year, the think tank says. It found there have been 31 million fewer GP appointments than usual since the pandemic began, with people with long-term conditions hit hardest. An additional 4,500 avoidable cancer deaths are expected this year alone because of disruptions to screening, diagnostic tests, and treatment. An extra 12,000 avoidable heart attacks and strokes are likely over the next 5 years, the State of Health and Care report adds. I'm not going to say that this was planned, because it can't be proved, and I would be kicked off YouTube if I said that it was. So, no, this wasn't planned. But it seems to me that the governments, or leaders like Andrew Cuomo in New York and others, discovered that if you stop treating people with cancer, heart disease, diabetes, the like, then they die. And once they die, you don't have to pay them pensions any longer, and you don't have to pay for their health care. When the NHS was founded after the Second World War, they had a strange belief. They believed that there was a sort of miasma of sickness in Britain, and that if people in Britain got free medical care, then this pond would be drained, and thus people would be healthier thereafter. What they discovered is that people who get sick and are cured live to get sick again, thus meaning more medical costs. When Enoch Powell was health minister in Britain, he discovered that the NHS could be responsible for 100% of the British budget if they let it. That is to say that rationing is essential to any such system. We have it, we have it in Canada. For instance, I mean, Canadians like to boast about their healthcare system. It's good in lots of respects, but emergency care, as it is in Britain, is a serious problem. And if you have let's say, a heart condition, where your heart's getting weaker and weaker and weaker, you get put on a waiting list in Canada, which is typically about 18 months, and a lot of people die on the waiting lists. And a fellow that I knew who was a big deal in the Reform Party, Canadian Alliance Party, he said that his father-in-law had such a debilitative condition, and eventually they had a whip round, and they raised $50,000 to send him to a hospital in Montana, just over the Alberta border, and he was fixed up within a week. It's a waiting game in Canada, and some people are not prepared to wait. Private care is not allowed in my country, which it doesn't make any sense at all. It's just Canadian hubris. If rich people, want to dip into their wallets, why not let them? That eases the burden on everyone else. Here's a story from the Foundation for Economic Education by Brad Palumbo. Billions of people across the globe continue to live under COVID-19 lockdowns or heavily restricted life. And for almost all of us, life amid the pandemic in 2020 was an isolating and difficult year. Yet doctors are warning that children in particular are experiencing grave mental health consequences as a result of the lockdowns, leading to an international epidemic of child suicide. The Associated Press interviewed Dr. David Greenhorn on the subject, who works in the emergency department at England's Bradford Royal Infirmary. The number of mental health crises he has seen, such as suicide attempts, has gone from a couple per week pre-pandemic to now several per day. And I'll break in to say that when people like Megan Mertz and Cara Delevingne and the like, they start talking about suicide, look, this has been known for decades. The more coverage suicide gets, the more suicides there are. Talking about suicide, praising suicide as a way out is deeply irresponsible. It's wicked. And yet, apparently, we can't stop ourselves from boasting about that time when we considered suicide or tried suicide. Well, yeah, again, as women, they're always trying suicide, but they rarely succeed. This is an international epidemic, and we are not recognizing it, Greenhorn said. In an 8-year-old's life, a year is a really, really, really long time. They are fed up. They can't see an end to it. This is absolutely true. I mean, try to go back to your childhood, and remember, when you were counting down the days to Christmas, or counting down the days to your birthday, or counting down the minutes to 3 o'clock when you were let out of school. And it just seemed interminable. Dr. Richard Delorme heads the psychiatric department at one of the largest children's hospitals in France, and he offered a similar warning. Delorme pointed out that it is clearly COVID restrictions and lockdowns taking this toll on children that end up in this hospital. What they tell you about is a chaotic world of, yes, I'm not doing my activities anymore. I'm no longer doing my music. Going to school is hard in the mornings. I am having difficulty waking up. I am fed up with this mask. Delorme's hospital went from seeing roughly 20 suicide attempts per month involving patients 15 or younger to more than double that, and disturbingly more determination than ever before in the attempts. We are very surprised by the intensity of the desire to die among children who may be 12 or 13 years old. We sometimes have children of 9 who already want to die, and it's not simply a provocation or a blackmail via suicide. It's a genuine wish to end their lives. You see how wicked these lockdowns are. One of the great things of being a child is that you're not responsible for anything that happens, or you're responsible for very little that happens. The world imposes on you. You don't impose on the world. And if conditions are bad, if you grow up in a bad family or whatever, eventually you become old enough such that you can leave. If you hate your school, eventually you'll grow old enough that you can leave. But with these COVID lockdowns, are they ever going to end? Are people ever going to be able to go around without masks? I know they are in some American states, but Britain and Canada, to give two examples, Germany, France, to give two more, they are just pushing this as hard as they can. You know, there's a lot of respiratory disease out there. Well, duh. But so maybe we should wear masks all the time. Let's turn ourselves into communist Chinese. The FEE story continues. This is one of the most painful paragraphs I've ever read, let alone had to write about. Merely typing out this story flooded my eyes with tears, but the life-threatening unintended consequences of drastic pandemic measures are too important to overlook. Government restrictions that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago have been forced through amid the fear and uncertainty that the pandemic's outbreak understandably wrought. Advocates undoubtedly hoped to save lives. Yet government restrictions have proven dubious in their effectiveness, with both studies and real-world examples demonstrating little clear relationship between lockdown stringency and COVID deaths. In the meantime, lockdowns and other restrictions have harshly curtailed social interaction and tragically catalyzing the aforementioned youth mental health crisis. Here in the U.S., the Centers for Disease Control reported that 25% of young adults considered suicide during the lockdowns, while overall mental health and suicide rates appear to have spiked as well. Is there ever going to be a reckoning for this? Are the people responsible for smothering society and smashing the economy ever going to be held to account? I rather doubt it, you know. After the fiasco of the 9/11 attacks, I thought, oh boy, I'm just waiting for the hundreds or thousands of people who are going to be sacked over this. No one got sacked. You know, dogs don't bite dogs, as they say. And well, if these people are going to be held accountable for their behavior, for their actions, then someday people might hold me accountable for my behavior, for my actions. And we can't have that. Going on to lockdown skeptics, Swedish school sends pupil home for wearing face mask. A mother in Sweden has revealed that her 13-year-old son was banned from attending classes at an international school in the Stockholm region until he agreed to remove the mask he was wearing. The local, an English-language Swedish news site, has more. Linus decided to wear a face mask when he returned to classes at the British International School Stockholm in Danderd, outside Stockholm on Monday. The school teaches around 550 children aged 3 to 17. I decided to wear a mask to school. The first lesson goes fine with it on, but then at the beginning of lesson 2, the teacher asked me to take my mask off, and of course I say that I didn't want to because of the coronavirus, he wrote in an email. Linus said he was then made to wait isolated in a room for 3 hours before his mother, Sarah Jefford, a wine educator who grew up in Switzerland, was able to pick him up. Toby Young comments, a wine educator? I didn't know that job existed. Where do I apply? NHS warns of significant reduction in vaccines. Britain's rollout of the vaccine has been successful to date. Half of all UK adults are expected to have had their first jab by the end of the week. A leaked NHS letter suggests, however, that a setback could be approaching in the form of a significant reduction in the weekly supply of COVID vaccines next month. A new United Nations report has laid bare the appalling costs of lockdowns in some of the world's poorest countries. The report, Direct and Indirect Effects of COVID-19 Pandemic and Response in South Asia, examines the effect of the unprecedented government shutdown policies on healthcare, social services, education, and the economy. It estimates that the disruption in healthcare services caused by government responses to COVID-19 in Afghanistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, home to 1.8 billion people, may have led to 239,000 maternal and child deaths. This compares to around 186,000 deaths with COVID-19, meaning the lockdowns are estimated to have killed considerably more than the virus. Furthermore, 228,000 is the estimated lockdown death toll just of children under 5, almost none of whom would have been at any risk from the virus. with the majority of COVID deaths worldwide being among over 80s. The difference in terms of quality adjusted life years must be staggering. Students at several UK universities have accused police officers of invading their privacy when checking for breaches of COVID rules. Universities have been complicit in this harassment, granting officers access to halls of residence. From The Guardian, students at several UK campuses have accused their universities of granting police officers access to halls of residence to check for breaches of coronavirus rules, with some complaints of officers entering accommodation in the middle of the night. What, not enough knife crime for you, bobbies? Students at Sheffield and Manchester who spoke to The Guardian described regular police patrols and widespread use of fines up to £800 as universities clamp down on the mixing of households to avoid repeating the major coronavirus outbreaks that occurred in autumn now that students are returning for the spring term. Yes, and how many university students in Britain have actually died of coronavirus? 1,000? 100? 10? Incredible. And, oh yes, Scotland's nonsensical COVID book ban. A student at the University of Edinburgh has written a stinging piece in The Spectator on the Scottish government's restrictions on library access. Why is the SNP, that's the Scottish National Party, banning books? On January 5th, the Scottish government introduced a strict new lockdown in response to the spread of a more infectious strain of COVID. As a student at the University of Edinburgh, one particular restriction has baffled me ever since. Unlike in England, Wales, or Northern Ireland, the Scottish government decided to ban students from reading, borrowing, or even touching books in their university libraries. Even as fears rose over the rapidly spreading Kent variant, it seemed that this policy lacked any scientific foundation. The Scottish government's explanation for its book ban is baffling and seems to be just copied and pasted advice from public websites and bluster over the importance of fighting COVID. Fighting COVID is important, of course, but it shouldn't be an excuse to abandon logic either. A quick look at the Scottish government's own COVID data, studies on how the disease spreads, and the ramifications for Scotland's already shameful educational inequality makes you wonder why this policy was ever introduced in the first place. It was introduced on the principle of because we can. Harry Warren, the piece author, quotes from a paper by Rutgers New Jersey Medical School evaluating the claim that COVID is spreading via library books. Presumably, he didn't come across the paper in a library. In a study in which the authors tried to mimic actual conditions in which a surface might be contaminated by a patient, no viable SARS-CoV-2 was detected on surfaces. In my opinion, the chance of transmission through inanimate surfaces is very small, and only in instances where an infected person coughs or sneezes on the surface and someone else touches that surface soon after the cough or sneeze. Harry comments, in other words, the transmission of COVID via university books is only feasible if an infected individual coughs or sneezes directly onto a page, which is then touched within 1 or 2 hours. Before the Scottish government mandated the book ban, Edinburgh University already isolated used books for a period of 72 hours, mitigating this already negligible risk. Remember a year ago when we were all terrified by surfaces, that COVID could live on a surface for up to 9 days? Oh my God, we're terrified of doorknobs now. Well, we know how COVID is transmitted now, and it's transmitted by breathing, coughing, or sneezing. The hysteria over surfaces was just, I don't know, conjured up pretty much out of nothing. Woven out of whole cloth, as they say. Holiday hopes sink for unvaccinated who will be banned from P&O cruises starting in summer. Yes, so we've passed a year, and golly, remember those good old days when it was going to be 3 weeks to flatten the curve? Oh no, this virus is acting like every other virus has ever acted in history. Golly, that's a big surprise. Who would have thunk it? Let's look at Alex Berenson. We now have strong real-world evidence from the UK and Denmark that the first dose leads to a temporarily increased infection risk. Thus, vaccinating vulnerable populations may well lead to a short-term spike in deaths, especially if the vaccinations happen during a wave. Had Pfizer, Moderna, etc., run proper clinical trials, that is, enrolled enough older people at high risk of death and followed them for, say, 6 months, we would have had a much better idea of how the vaccines affect both COVID and all-cause mortality. Oh, well, next pandemic. Martin Koldorf says, after having protecting themselves while the working class were exposed to the virus, the vaccinated Zoomers now want vaccine passports, where immunity from prior infection does not count, despite stronger evidence for protection. One more assault on working people. Alex Berenson comments, fact check, yep. And it's not just classists, it turns the data upside down. The number of fully vaccinated people who've been infected in Israel alone dwarfs the number known reinfected after recovery worldwide, which strongly suggests natural immunity beats the vaccine kind. Jonathan Chait is a writer for New York Magazine, very upset with Alex Berenson. He tweeted at him, masks work, vaccines work, you are a lunatic. Berenson responds, notice he didn't say lockdowns work. Masks don't work. Jury is way out on vaccines. Don't worry, you'll get there. If you could do it with schools, you can do it with masks. Let's go back to the chat, see what's happening there. Visionary. We're talking about Patti Smith. Visionary companion just kids my ass. By the time Smith met Robert Mapplethorpe, he was well on his way to being a horned horror. Indeed. He's a gifted photographer, though. A portrait of Patti Smith on her first album is quite good. Adam says the social distancing and germophobia at school is worse than having kids stay home. I saw a class of elementary kids sitting outside 10 feet apart the other day. You know, back in the day, kids at recess and at lunch, they used to play games, card games, marble games. They used to play sports. They'd be running around, having a good time. I worked for a school district 30 years ago now. And I noticed that few kids seem to go outside anymore. They were all talking about, what they'd seen on TV the night before. Now, of course, they're all on their smartphones. And so now with the coronavirus, we've determined just to kill the social instinct amongst our children. Golly, I can't see what bad could come of that. Visionary companion says, I attracted attention at Safeway while trying to stifle a sneeze. A concerned lady thought I was having a convulsion. Yeah, thinking back a year ago, I remember when I was in public, if I had to cough or sneeze, I would, take great efforts, to stifle this, because I thought it was going to be like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where people would be pointing at me. He's got it. He's got it. Glib Medley says, Julie Burchill's book had previously been dropped by Little Brown for comments about Islam. Yeah, and again, Little Brown, they have recommitted themselves to free speech, except wherein it offends Muslims. Let's see. Mapplethorpe brought out the Philistine in me, says Visionary Companion. Just an appalling story. Larry Kramer, who was the founder of what was it called? The Gay Men's Health Crisis and ACT UP, which was a terrorist organization. He wrote a book which was published by, I believe, Random House. It came out around 1979. And it was called Faggots. Don't censor me, YouTube. Larry Kramer, the famed Larry Kramer, wrote a novel called Faggots. And I found it, in the remainder pile, hardcover book for $1. So I thought, okay, I'll read this. I thought I had a cast iron stomach. But I guess I was wrong. I have never read a book as sickening as this. Essentially, Larry Kramer describes the lives of male homosexuals in New York before AIDS. It is barely believable, the things that these people got up to. And now with Truvada, they're getting up to it again. A Star Rover says Ukraine schools are open as normal with no masks or social distancing. Neighboring Poland schools are closed with Zoom classes. I'm very disappointed in the Poles over this. Their panic. Glib Medley says, I remember being on a dating app and negging all the Brooklyn girls whose profile included loving Patti Smith's book about her and Robert Mapplethorpe. Pete Ferguson says, well, just tested positive for COVID today and have to quarantine. Time to blare Isolation by Joy Division and organize my ammo cabinet. I have indulged in marathon sessions of listening to Joy Division. I do not recommend their music for anyone who is depressed. No, not a good idea. Visionary Companion says the Gloomy Sunday Syndrome. That's a reference to what is a Hungarian song, wasn't it? About suicide. I recall Lydia Lunch covered that song on her album Queen of Siam, which, she's an arty weirdo, but a pretty good record, I thought. Star Rover says a relative lives in Canada. She says anything doctors don't want to treat is labeled as elective. Yes, indeed, I have heard about this from a close relative who has been terribly sick for the last 2 years and been close to death several times. And he told me about a week ago that the doctor basically tells him that, he's some faker hogging hospital time. And my brother blew up at him. This is essentially a life-saving operation, which the surgeon simply doesn't want to do. Visionary Companion says, I never got Patty. Never trust anyone who tells you her main influence is Rimbaud, that admits she has never read his work and only liked him because he looked like Dylan. Yes, she was always on about Rimbaud. I suspect that she liked Arthur Rimbaud, a sad story his, because he was a pretty young boy who had a infamous homosexual affair with the much older poet, Paul Verlaine. Here's a story about Arthur Rimbaud, which I read in the standard biography of him, that he spent close to 20 years in Africa, including in places where no white men had ever been. He was said to have been a gun runner, a slave trader, etc., etc. So when he was about 36 years old, he returned to France and he was quite ill. And his sister remarked that she knew he was dying because he had stopped being sarcastic. Very sad indeed. Okay. The lyrics of Joy Division's Disorder are typical Curtis, but the tune will pump you up. Yeah, there is that. You do get that anomaly. You see that in Steely Dan as well, where, the music is down and the lyrics are up, or vice versa. Visionary Companion says the movie about Rimbaud and Verlaine with Leonardo DiCaprio was very, very bad. So bad it was good. Okay. So, what are we going to talk about next? We're going to talk about trans equality. This is from Jordan Davidson at The Federalist. Author and writer for the Wall Street Journal, Abigail Schreier, testified to the Senate Judiciary Committee on Wednesday about the dangers of the Equality Act, explaining that the bill hinders equality instead of reinforcing it. Quote, if S393 merely proposed to extend employment and public housing rights to gay and transgender Americans, I would be supporting this bill instead of testifying against it. I'm here today because the bill does much more, and no one who wrote it appears to have thoughtfully considered what it would mean for women and girls, unquote. Not only did Schreier note that the bill would hurt female athletes whose hard work and achievements in sports could be usurped by a biological male who identifies as a woman, but she also raised questions about the risk associated with housing biological males with females in correctional facilities and domestic violence shelters, as well as allowing male teachers who say they are female to accompany young girls to the bathroom in schools. Does that strike anyone in this room as safe or sensible? Schreier asked. The plain truth is that it is not sensible, not safe, and certainly not just to end these hard-won protections for women and girls in the name of equality. The legislation, Schreier explained, has nothing to do with transgender people and everything to do with opportunistic self-identification by violent male felons who will take advantage of instances such as when the Washington Correctional Center for Women allowed prisoners to live in certain facilities based on their gender identities, resulting in the rape of at least one female. If you pass this bill, you can expect hundreds more victims like this one, Schreier warned. Instead of supporting the protections for biological sex outlined in Title IX and established by women such as the late U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Schreier said congressional proponents and supporters of the Equality Act are concerned about the progressive groups that will call you a transphobe or a homophobe if you don't do exactly as they say and abandon women and girls. I have probably interviewed more transgender Americans than any person in this room, and I can honestly say that, excepting political activists, most do not want to obliterate women's rights and safe spaces, Schreier said. Most would never think of stealing women's scholarships by forcing young women into demoralizing contests with male bodies. But gender ideology, which is at the heart of this bill, is misogyny in progressive clothing. Gender ideology tells women and girls that they are not entitled to their fear or their sense of unfairness as their protected spaces are eliminated. Scientists agree that gender identity can be very ephemeral, Schreier noted, but if this legislation is passed, it would be impossible ever to legally distinguish between a woman and a biological male who claims a female identity. In the name of inclusivity, you'll have made life far less safe, far less fair, and far less inclusive for America's women and girls, Schreier concluded. Schreier is the author of Irreversible Damage, the Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, which I reviewed on the book club a few months ago. It has my highest recommendations. This is a deeply shocking book about a form of mania, a form of madness, which has been mainstream and is wrecking the lives of tens of thousands, and perhaps it will eventually be hundreds of thousands of young women. You know, when these girls are given puberty blockers, it effectively ends their physical and mental development. If they go on these at the age of 11 or whatever, that's where they're stuck for the rest of their life, with an 11-year-old body and an 11-year-old brain. People should be in prison for this, but instead they are congratulated for pushing this madness. Oh, here's another one. This is from the Federalist, Jordan Davidson. Democrat senators compared opposing the Equality Act on religious grounds to the Ku Klux Klan burning crosses and the Confederacy's biblical justifications for slavery. I do believe that people who want to blatantly discriminate and use religion as their weapon have gone too far. We have to have limits on what they can do. Senate Judiciary Chair Dick Durbin of Illinois said at Wednesday's hearings. Oh, Dick Durbin, he's a moderate Democrat. I might remind us in history that the Ku Klux Klan was not burning question marks, they were burning a cross. They were making some distorted connection with religion, and God forbid that anyone would buy that. We don't need that in America, regardless of the time, regardless of the organization, wherever they come down on the political spectrum. Democrat Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey made similar comments earlier in the hearing, claiming that those opposed to expanding access to protected spaces based on their gender identity, because it would limit their abilities to practice what they believe about biological sex, are similar to slaveholders who used Bible verses to justify slavery. Once again, there's no condemnation of slavery in either the Old or the New Testament, which seems to now to be a shock to most people. But again, slavery is a constant in human history. It's, as Hilaire Belloc said, it's the default state of humanity. Using religion as a shield is something that's been done for many years as a shield for discrimination. Booker stated, "I believe in freedom of religion. I believe in free exercise. I believe in the fundamentals that our country was founded upon. But I also know that for too long, religion was used to discriminate and has been a painful part of the story of America." Yeah. Sam Hyde joked about mandatory government-mandated homosexuality. I suppose if that comes about, Dick Durbin and Cory Booker will instruct us that it's just like slavery and the KKK. And how do you measure hate crimes? It seems to me that it's immeasurable because what are you looking for? Do you have cameras placed on everybody at all times? Do you have cameras placed at everything that's going on in the world? No, you don't. But there's an industry of counting hate crimes now. And of course, at the lead is the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, the ADL. This is from the New York Post. Joshua Rhett Miller. The distribution of white supremacist propaganda skyrocketed last year, hitting an all-time high, according to a report released Wednesday by the ADL. The 5,125 instances of racist, anti-Semitic, or anti-alphabet people flyers, stickers, posters, and banners disseminated by far-right and white supremacist groups in 2020 was nearly double the 2,724 cases reported in 2019. I guess they were just looking harder. That's an average of about 14 incidents per day in a country of 330 million people. This is absolutely laughable. And it's the highest level the group has seen in its more than a decade of tracking the phenomenon, ADL officials told the Post. The organization first started plotting the data set on its hate, extremism, anti-Semitism, terrorism map in 2016, but the ADL has been monitoring far-right activity for more than 10 years, a spokesman said. Hate, extremism, anti-Semitism, terrorism, heat. Wouldn't hate, anti-Semitism, terrorism, and extremism, meaning hate, wouldn't that have been better? Okay, so I'm looking at one of these dreadful examples of hate speech. And there's two posters, one above the other. The first one says, multiculturalism has failed. And the second one says, reject white guilt. Ooh, how very, very hateful. Multiculturalism has failed? Reject white guilt? Why, that's worse than Hitler. According to the Post, at least 30 known white supremacist groups sent out hateful propaganda last year, and just 3 were responsible for 92% of the incidents. And I wonder how many of the members of these 3 groups are agents of the federal government. They were identified as the Texas-based Patriot Front, the New Jersey European Heritage Association, and the National Socialist Club, a neo-Nazi group with chapters nationwide and around the globe. Yeah, the Nationalist Social Club. Boy, I bet people are beating down the doors to be part of that organization. The Patriot Front, which is led by white supremacist Thomas Rousseau, was responsible for more than 4,100 of the incidents alone, or 80% of the entire tally. You know, if one tiny little group is responsible for 80% of any phenomenon, this suggests to me that the phenomenon itself is tiny. The group used ambiguous phrases such as America First and United We Stand, deeply deeply racist. In its propaganda, the ADL said, but it pushed white supremacist and neo-fascist views. Well, apparently, voting for Donald Trump is an example of neo-fascism. ADL CEO Jonathan Greenblatt said white supremacists appear to be more emboldened than ever when citing the election year and the pandemic as possible factors. In the era of social media, white supremacists plan and amplify their campaigns online, but they still rely on old-fashioned tactics to spread their messages of hate, which can range from chest-thumping nationalism to outright bigotry. Wait. Chest-thumping nationalism? Chauvinism, as I used to call it? That's hate? Is it? My country is the best? That's a hate statement? These people are really pushing their luck. But I suppose as long as they get away with it, we'll continue to push it. Here's a piece by Henry Delacroix on the American Sun called No One Looks. It begins, Netflix churns out awful woke content. Every show is woke appropriate. The one refuge seems to be documentaries. Sure, there are plenty of left-wing framing and content, but occasionally something can slip through with minimal progressive flavoring. Made You Look is one such documentary. I recommend watching this little window into the world of the rich and the ridiculous patronage of the fine arts. This documentary checks the boxes for, well, a documentary that our crowd would make. Made You Look covers a multi-decade fraud pulled on oblivious 1% cosmopolitans using the garbage art of the abstract modern painters that the CIA manufactured into the IT crowd. It was performed by wealthy immigrants with no attachment to America and the Knoedler Art Gallery of New York. At the end of the day, the rich get off without any prison sentence. This is swept under the rug, and the art world is shaken as now everyone worries about forgeries in galleries. The key from an art perspective here is that the modern abstract painters were producing garbage that laymen knew was crap. Yet the in-crowd said it was high art. This fraud in its own right was exposed over 50 years ago with the Pierre Brasseur hoax, when a primate painted, fooling art critics who, when confronted with the hoax, doubled down on their praise. We have known for decades that it's all a joke they pull to consider themselves the enlightened insiders, while plebeians do not understand or get the fantastic garbage. That garbage itself was a CIA creation. Francis Saunders' book, The Cultural Cold War, is a must-read for how the CIA funded and molded nearly all art, visual and written, in the fight against the Soviet system. America was so free that it would allow this type of creativity to flourish. All of the Mockingbird assets were used, as even in this documentary, they show how Time magazine was calling Jackson Pollock the most famous living American artist alive. They memed Pollock into fame. The regular Joe Sixpack sees it as swirling chaos. The BFA knows the right words to say to appreciate it and to justify the multi-million-dollar auction prices. That's what comes into play here. An immigrant out of Long Island waltzes into Knoedler and starts to spin a tale. It's a great con worthy of a movie script. She knows exactly what to say to play up the idea that she has an heir to a rich dead private owner who has an unknown until today collection of abstract paintings to unload. This immigrant has another immigrant, a Chinese painter, who manufactures these forgeries in his garage in Queens. The right names are said, the right names are dropped. The style of the paintings looks close enough to fit. The real hinge is the star of the show, Anne Friedman, who deserves an Oscar for her performance. She is either the dumbest woman in America or the best actress. She denies anything was fake, and she claims not to be involved with the con. Her interview segments are the best, especially when they come back to her after a man or woman has described an event and she contradicts it. Maybe a he said, she said is believable once, and she does it with so many people that the constant is her faulty memory. Within her stories, though, one sees how the modern art crowd has their head up their ass. Galleries accept these forgeries as legit and show them. Art experts look at these and claim they are originals, and some even write strong letters of authentication. Others do not. Some do not fall for this con, so the question of money is in play. Were those other experts paid off to sign off on them? This is important as the money involved is staggering. The sales of these forgeries kept Knoedler afloat. Armand Hammer's pockets fattened, and Friedman earned tens of millions in commissions. Even after taxes, Hammer enjoyed 200 to 800% profits on the sales. There was also the prestige of these finds and sales. They had uncovered hidden gems for the rest of the art world. This was a huge draw for these experts to flex their knowledge of the long-dead artists. This was a draw for buyers, too. These buyers were hedge fundies, Goldman Sachs executives, and the elite of New York City. They wanted these paintings and, surprisingly, never asked why they were getting them so cheap if they were real. The con fell apart, though, once one buyer asked for forensic analysis of a purchase. The data came back with proof that paints used in these were first made years, even decades after artists died. Other bits started to come out, like the paintings signed with misspellings. Experts claimed they could not imagine one forger could copy these artists' styles. But seriously, when it is Pollock's mess or Rothko's blocks, how hard would it be to fake? Simple financial auditing proved no money was going back to the original collector. No one serves a jail because the prime target was a small fish who got time served. The Chinese forger hopped on a flight to China and is untouchable. The mastermind who had committed similar frauds in the past is chilling in his home country of Spain. America is an economic zone to do business and crime. Friedman and Hammer were never brought to justice because the federal prosecutors felt it would be too tough to convince beyond a reasonable doubt fraud occurred. Therein lies the big fraud. These modern abstract artists were a giant con played on the art world and society. These paintings get swapped, millions change hands, and the rich get to feel elite. This is their racket. Besides real estate, art sales are the only good that is exempt from money laundering rules. It's all a racket, and you are not allowed into it. The photographs from swanky parties of buyers, sellers, and the art crowd hammer the point home that we have an elite that is not an elite. This is an aristocracy LARPing as aristocracies of old. The old aristocrats were patrons of the art. These people try to do the same. All they can do is patronize what they are told, which is pathetic modern art. Even within that framework, they are merely there for fashion and cannot prevent their patronage from falling into the muck. Their art is the same as their rule, fraudulent and disconnected from the masses they supposedly serve as stewards. It seemed to me that another reason why this disgusting, modern art, the stuff that Charles Saatchi made a sensation, the reason why it has become so big, worth so much money, is all the real art has been sold again and again. All of the good art is in museums, or it is held privately by very wealthy people. And yet it's not as if the art market was going to say, okay, there's nothing good to sell anymore, so we're going to close up shop. No, how about we cut a shark in half and put it in a tank full of formaldehyde and say that this is genius? How about we take a slutty woman's bed with, condom wrappers on it and the like, and say that this is genius? I mean, these suckers will buy anything. And as been proved, they will buy anything. If they're told it's great, they'll buy it. They no longer trust themselves. That is the really remarkable thing. My eyes are useless. I have to have some blurb tell me that this is transgressive and miraculous. Well, sure, that's worth $500,000 or £500,000, right? Let's go back to the chat and have a look. Fire Island. What did you think of the Shawshank Redemption, says Palcasso 88? It's a great teenage revenge film. That's what I'll say about it. Oh my, that warden certainly wasn't completely over the top, was he? Oh, and he's a Christian too. Boo! You can tell who the bad people are in Stephen King's works because they're identified up front as Christians. Ooh, they must be evil. Enron says, I sort of liked it years ago, but now I see it as an attack on organized religion or religious faith in general. Steve says, I remember a news story about a modern art installation that was removed by the building's cleaning crew, which literally thought it was trash. Yes, I told a story, I think maybe a few weeks ago, that I was assigned by my magazine to cover an art exhibit at the Edmonton Art Museum. And I went there, and there's a device that tracks the humidity in the room, because you have to control the humidity to protect the artwork. And there's a card, there's a pen, and it just, it tracks the humidity like this. And I saw someone walk up to this and stare at it and think, is this part of the exhibit? Maybe it is. I don't want to seem ignorant. So he stared at it. He took a few steps back, looked to the, went to the left, went to the right. And he attracted a crowd with all of these other people coming to look at the device that measured humidity. Wasn't Hilton Kramer a promoter of abstract art, says Max Vitriol? Yes, I believe that is true. I interviewed Hilton Kramer once. He was complaining about standards in classical music, how it's promoted. And he told a story about when he was a schoolboy, when all of the schoolboys would, collect their nickels and dimes and quarters so that they could see Koussevitzky conduct the Boston Symphony. And I thought, that's a different world you are talking about. Jokerkin666 says Ballard has a great ST on art fraud in Terminal Beach. Anrun likes the movie Dunkirk. Palpicasso88 says, I thought it was okay, but I've always been surprised at how highly regarded it is. Visionary companion, Cy Twombly, a true genius indeed. At least I am told that he was by many earnest prattlers. I don't know. I came across this name a couple of months ago. One of his works was used as a basis of an album cover or whatever. And then, oh, yes, the great Cy Twombly. And my response was, if you say so. No. Yves Lenoir once wrote about Picasso that there used to be objective standards in art, that someone was deemed to be great. And, well, yes, we understand that he's great. Well, why is he great? Oh, because of his technical prowess, his command of the subject, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. His ability to transfigure reality. You see, with Picasso, that all went the window. You either got Picasso or you didn't get him. Oh, you don't like Damien Hirst and his half a shark in a tank of formaldehyde? Oh, I suppose you're one of those people. What, Philistine? Really? Because I don't think that a shark, half a shark in a tank or a messy bed is art. Yeah, that's what art is about. It's about the trend. It's about transfiguration. Tom Anderson says the CIA was behind the rise of Rothko and also Pollock. Absolutely true. You see, the argument was that they had old-fashioned standards in the Soviet Union and the communist world. In music, in painting, sculpture, all the rest. But in America, you could just go nuts. You could splatter paint at a canvas and you'd be acclaimed as a genius and you'd become rich. And that's why America is better than communism. Just an utterly ridiculous argument. I'm sure not a few people at the time thought, yeah, if that's what America stands for, I'm not so sure about this anymore. Half Galician says George Costanza bought triangles. Indeed, he did. But we saw that the painter the female painter in that show, she was quite skilled at a portraiture. You've probably seen the famous portrait that she did of Catherine Keener, played the painter, that she did of Kramer, which has become a popular poster. Rothko is awful. Yeah, there's a scene in Mad Men where the big boss, the co-founder of the firm, he's bought a Rothko, and he's paid some fabulous sum for it. And so they break into his office one night to look at it, and it's a big square overlapping another square. Yeah, but you have to look deeply into it. If I look any deeper into this, all I'm going to see are, points. Because it's one colored square overlapping another colored square. I don't really see the transcendence, the transfiguration there. KMG, what's your favorite episode of Seinfeld? Well, that would have to be the opposite. Because I thought that, that pretty much is very close to my own life. If everything that you have done in your life has not worked, then maybe you should do the opposite. I just love the bit where George acts manly in the theater for his date, Dee Dee Pfeiffer. And then when they're in their car outside the apartment building, she asks, maybe you should come up for some coffee. And George says, no, I don't think that's a very good idea. I don't really know you very well. And she says, who are you? And then, of course, he starts railing at George Steinbrenner for turning the New York Yankees into a joke. Steinbrenner says, hire that man. Anaran says, I know my least favorite, The Contest. Visionary Companion says the movie Local Color was a clever put down of the painted word silliness. Not a great movie, but some funny scenes of deserved derision. I'm sure that the people who touted Pollock and Rothko, many of them are outraged, by the Charles Saatchi, the British Young Artists movement. Well, if you can get away with selling rectangles for millions of dollars and splatters of paint on a canvas for millions of dollars, well, the sky's the limit. Is it not? I'm going to show you what it's like, says Matthew Gubbins. Yes, that's from the opposite. Jerry Seinfeld said that this was an actual line uttered by Buddy Rich, the famed jazz drummer, that Rich was a notorious bastard, and he used to rail at his band in the bus after concerts. And one day, one of the band members decided to tape this, and it started circulating like the later famous, also infamous Troggs tapes, and people could hardly believe it. I'm going to show you what it's like. What does that even mean? Okay, so I am going to go back to the elites, Burnham's the Machiavellians, defenders of freedom. We were talking about the use of force and how Vilfredo Pareto says that, well, yes, ultimately all disputes are settled by force. Burnham continues, that is one side of the matter, but in addition, the argument may be carried further and directed against the use of force in any sense whatsoever. Such arguments express a concentration of Class 1 residues at the expense of Class 2 in the elite whose spokesmen formulate the arguments. The dispute is really as to the relative merits of shrewdness and force, and to decide it in the sense that never, not even in the exceptional case, is it useful to meet wits with violence. It would be necessary first to show that the use of cunning is always, without exception, more advisable than the use of force. Suppose a certain country has a governing class A that assimilates the best elements as regards intelligence in the whole population. In that case, the subject class B is largely stripped of such elements and can have little or no hope of ever overcoming the class A, so long as it is a battle of wits. If intelligence were to be combined with force, the domination of the A's would be perpetual. But such a happy combination occurs only for a few individuals. In the majority of cases, people who rely on their wits are or become less fitted to use violence and vice versa. So concentration in the class A of the individuals most adept at chicanery leads to a concentration in class B of the individuals most adept at violence. And if that process is long continued, the equilibrium tends to become unstable because the A's are long in cunning but short in the courage to use force and in the force itself, whereas the B's have the force and the courage to use it, but are short in the skill required for exploiting those advantages. But if they chance to find leaders who have this skill, and history shows that such leadership is usually supplied by dissatisfied A's, they have all they need for driving the A's from power. Or just that development history affords countless examples from remotest times all the way down to the present. We see this in the United States today. That it was once possible, 2 generations ago, for people to grow up in their small towns and earn a decent living in those small towns. That is no longer possible. People get sucked to various bug hives. What? On the West Coast, we have Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles. On the East Coast, we have New York, Boston, Washington, D.C., and not quite on the coast, just a little bit inward, Atlanta, etc. That no, you have to leave your family, your community, your traditions behind and move to a bug hive. Otherwise, there's no decent work for you. And so these are, people who, if we're talking about the bees, they greatly improved that class of people. But no, they're not allowed to live among the bees anymore. They have to become bug hive people. And the qualities that they had, when they lived in their small towns, in their hamlets, they become attenuated when they move to the bug hive. They start carrying on about avocado toast, or they give the soylent grin when an Amazon package arrives. Burnham continues, the result of such a revolution, for the passage just quoted is simply the generalized description of the form of social revolutions, is to get rid of the weaker elements of the old elite, open up the elite to a rapid influx of new elements, and to alter the balance of residues in the elite in favor of those from class 2. In spite of the cost of revolution in bloodshed and suffering, it may, under certain circumstances, be both necessary and socially beneficial. Even in the latter case, however, it is always an illusion to suppose that the masses themselves take power through a revolution. The masses can never successfully revolt until they acquire a leadership, which is always made up in part of able and ambitious individuals from their own ranks who cannot gain entrance into the governing elite, and in part of disgruntled members of the existing elite, members of the nobility, for example, in the opening stages of the French Revolution, and I could add the priesthood as well, or dissatisfied intellectuals and middle-class persons in the Russian Revolution. So long, therefore, as the governing elite is both willing and in a position to destroy or to assimilate all such individuals, it has a virtual guarantee against internal revolution. And if the revolution does take place, we merely find a new elite, or more properly, a renewed elite, for the old is almost never wholly wiped out in the saddle. Nevertheless, the change might quite possibly be for the benefit of the community as a whole, and specifically of the masses, who, remaining the ruled and not rulers, may be better off than before. This is what we saw with Donald Trump. Here was a disgruntled member of the elite who saw what was happening to the bees and decided to become their leader and to help them. And people who, in the past, would have been admitted to the elite, but now that America has become largely a hereditary oligarchy, were not permitted to enter the elite. They rose and they followed his banner. Pareto's theory of the circulation of the elites is thus a theory of social change, of revolution, and of social development and degeneration. It is a restatement in new and more intricate terms of the point of view common to the modern Machiavellians and found more crude in Machiavelli himself. Pareto claims, as we have seen, that though we can come to objective conclusions about the strength of a society relative to other societies, we cannot make any objective judgment about what type of social structure is best from the point of view of internal welfare. However, a certain tendency in his own feelings becomes evident from his analysis. To begin with, he plainly puts external strength first, since it is a precondition of everything else. That is, if a nation cannot survive, it is rather pointless to argue in the abstract whether or not it's a good society. In order to survive, a society must have a fairly free class circulation. The elite must not bar its doors too rigidly. This freedom will at the same time, on the whole, operate to increase the internal well-being of the society. Well, if you have an elite, I say in the United States, that decides to destroy the value of the public schools and sets up an apprenticeship system, I suppose you could say, where, I don't have a job? You're not going to pay me for my work? Oh, everyone does this now. Oh, so I have to give a year or two of my life for no pay? to tremendously rich people because they had the right parents and I did not. This is a very weak society. And I think we might be surprised at how quickly it falls apart. Second, in discussing the distribution of residues, Pareto implicitly joins the other Machiavellians in an evident preference for social checks and balances. The strongest and healthiest societies balance a predominance of class 1 residues in the elite with a predominance of class 2 residues in the non-elite. But class 2 residues must not be altogether excluded from the elite. If class 2 residues prevail in all classes, the nation develops no active culture, degenerates in a slough of brutality and stubborn prejudice, in the end is unable to overcome new forces in its environment and meets disaster. Disaster, too, awaits the nation given over wholly to class 1 residues, with no regard for the moral, for discipline or tradition, with a blind confidence in clever tricks as a sufficient means for salvation. Well, looking at the United States Congress, I'll repeat, disaster, too, awaits the nation given over wholly to class 1 residues with no regard for the moral, for discipline or tradition, with a blind confidence in clever tricks as a sufficient means for salvation. Yes, we're supposed to regard Nancy Pelosi as a latter-day Daniel Webster or Henry Clay, are we? Ho, ho, very satirical. The laws of the circulation of the elites serve not only to clarify our understanding of societies of the past, they illuminate also our analysis of present societies and even sometimes permit us to predict the future course of social events. Writing in the years just prior to the First World War, Pareto analyzed at length the United States and the principal nations of Europe. He found that the mode of circulation of the elites during the preceding centuries had brought most of those nations into a condition where the ruling classes were heavily overweighted with class 1 residues and were subject to debilitating forms of humanitarian beliefs. The results of such a condition he summarizes as follows, quote, "A mere handful of citizens, so long as they are willing to use violence, can force their will upon public officials who are not inclined to meet violence with equal violence. If the reluctance of the officials to resort to force is primarily motivated by humanitarian sentiments, the result ensues very readily. But if they refrain from violence because they deem it wiser to use some other means, the effect is often the following. To prevent or resist violence, the governing class resorts to diplomacy, fraud, corruption. Government authority passes, in a word, from the lions to the foxes. The governing class bows its head under the threat of violence, but it surrenders only in appearances, trying to turn the flank of the obstacle it cannot demolish in frontal attack. In the long run, that sort of procedure comes to exercise a far-reaching influence on the selection of the governing classes, which is now recruited only from the foxes, while the lions are blackballed. The individual who best knows the arts of sapping the strength of the foes of graft and of winning back by fraud and deceit what seemed to have been surrendered under pressure of force is now leader of leaders. The man who has bursts of rebellion and does not know how to crook his spine at the proper times and places is the worst of leaders, and his presence is tolerated among them only if other distinguished endowments offset that defect. So it comes about that the residues of the combination instinct, class 1, are intensified in the governing class, and the residues of group persistence, class 2, debilitated. For the combination residues supply precisely the artistry and resourcefulness required for evolving ingenious expedients as substitutes for open resistance, while the residues of group persistence stimulate open resistance, since a strong sentiment of group persistence cures the spine of all tendencies to curvature. Policies of the governing class are not planned too far ahead in time. Predominance of the combination instincts and enfeeblement of the sentiments of group persistence result in making the governing class more satisfied with the present and less thoughtful of the future. The individual comes to prevail, and by far over family, community, nation. Material interests and interests of the present or near future come to prevail over the ideal interests of community or nation and interests of the distant future. The impulse is to enjoy the present without too much thought for the morrow. Some of these phenomena become observable in international relations as well. Wars become essentially economic. Efforts are made to avoid conflicts with the powerful, and the sword is rattled only before the weak. Wars are regarded more than anything else as speculations. A country is often unwittingly edged towards war by nursings of economic conflicts, which, it is expected, will never get out of control and turn into armed conflicts. Not seldom, however, a war will be forced upon a country by peoples who are not so advanced in the evolution that leads to the predominance of Class 1 residues. Well, let's look at what happened in January 6th. People are led into the Capitol building for reasons that remain mysterious, because those doors could not have been breached, short of possession of a howitzer. And most of them act like tourists. A bunch start knocking things over and smashing glass and the like. So the members of Congress and their staffers, they hide and they tremble in terror. Apparently, it was never a thought to stand up to these people. No, that was simply that was not in consideration. Look, we pay people to do that sort of thing for us, Well, if you're not prepared to defend yourself, and if people, bursting into your building leads you to almost, tremble yourself to death, this just exposes how weak your rule is. I'll have more to say about Pareto and the circulation of elites on tomorrow's show. Let's go back to the chat. Halper, the sword is rattled only before the weak. Wow. Yes, as I mentioned before, since the debacle of Vietnam, America has gone into wars only with countries that could not fight back or would not fight back. And as a result, the military has become a laboratory. Yeah, pregnant women, transsexuals. What else you got? Winning wars? No. America has total air superiority. We don't need to worry about the infantry. Many people are saying that if it comes to it, in a war with China, or perhaps even in a war with Iran, the United States might be in for a nasty shock. Lamprey Melt, hello, says in Cambodia, it is common to use interns as a form of slave labor. In return, employers state it's good job experience. I now see the same thing in the U.S. Yako Raipala, our Finnish friend, says that's the part of the meme insurrection that convinced me that America is going to have some sort of revolution or Soviet-style total regime collapse. Well, you see, with the type 1 people, okay, it's not enough that they now have the president and they have both houses of Congress. No, they have declared war on the losers, which include the white majority of the United States. Hubris will meet its nemesis. I joke, as far as my country goes, I joked some years ago that 200 men with 22 rifles could take Ottawa. I don't really think it's that much of a joke, Ogun's Iron says this stuff is so dense in insights. Indeed, it is. People talking about, Ogun's Iron said, I liked it way before avocado toast. They can't make me stop liking it. Well, this is a boon to the avocado industry, because I read about 20 years ago that most of avocados farmed in the United States went into dog food. That avocado was simply not that popular. USA Elite, like so many elites of the past, has doors open to elites from elsewhere, but not to foreign countrymen. It's a perennial problem. Elites truly of the people don't seem to last long, says Ogun's Iron. Tom Anderson says avocado very high in polyunsaturated fatty acid. Visionary Companion says a character in Booth Tarkington's The Magnificent Amberson sees the handwriting on the wall about the way the automobile was going to tribute to that flight from hometowns and a general fragmentation. Isaac Asimov said violence is the last refuge of the incompetent. Jerry Purnell's riposte, yes, the competent don't wait that long. Purnell was the first place I learned about Burnham. The guys wear white shirts. My trail of disgrace. This is a, what, Anka video? Paul Anka? There's a similar tape with Paul Anka, I think, ranting about of his band's dress code. Golly, I would have thought him to have been a mild-mannered fellow. He's from Ottawa, Paul Anka. Of course, that was a long time ago. That's how you can spot the Canadian in a crowd, because he's the one who says he's really Canadian. We're still claiming Neil Young, who turned his back on Canada in 1966. Well, Joni Mitchell too, although I think she may have a home. I think she may have a home in this country. Ogan's Iron KMG. Still, doesn't the USA have such ridiculous techno superiority that if it did decide to do a real war, it will win handily? Bad, horrible people, but the deadliest toys still. Well, I don't know about that. The Chinese have been stealing, for many years, American technology, and the Russians working very hard on, the latest technology. I mean, I just... The idea of America fomenting a war with Russia is so insane. But now that Biden is in power and the neocons are back in the saddle, perhaps they'll get their war. What is coming up on the show? Well, let's take a look. Tomorrow is Theater Thursday, and as mentioned earlier, I'm going to be talking about the movies Valley of the Dolls and Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. I'm interested in these films because they, the two films, they show very much how quickly the culture changed in the 1960s. That the whole presentation, the music and the dressing and all that, it just seemed, from the perspective of Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, which was 3 years later, it just seemed from another age. It just seemed so corny. Of course, it's become dated as well. And on the book club this week, I'm going to be talking about Tom Wolfe's final novel, which is set in Miami, and is called Back to Blood. And it's about La Raza, the race. Yes, that's what it has come down to in America. And next Monday, March 22nd, on Music Monday, I'm going to be discussing the phenomenon which arose in the 1970s of so-called authentic classical performance. Oh, yes. See, the living tradition was abandoned by some, and it was ground zero time. And in my opinion, ground zero is never a good idea. I will be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. And if you like this show or any part of it, I'd appreciate if you click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you would like to make a donation to this live stream, which I could really use at this time, no joke. My PayPal account is linked to kevin_grace@hotmail.com. That is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. If you're Canadian, you can send a donation directly to this live stream via interact@kevingrace@shaw.ca. Paul Anka, yes, Lebanese Christian, I believe. And I will leave you with this, as always, in these days of social atomization and societal collapse. I hope that all my dear viewers and listeners manage to find a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.